She didn't cry when they left her in the snow. Not when the wind howled through the trees. Not even when her puppies stopped moving beneath her. But someone, heard her silence. A stranger. A boy with a book. A woman who'd forgotten how to hope. And maybe, God, this isn't just a story about a dog abandoned in the cold. It's about the warmth that faith can still bring, even in the middle of winter. Stay with us. What happened next wasn't just rescue. It was redemption. The winter of Bozeman, Montana, was not kind. It swept in with a cold that felt personal, sharp winds that sliced through the trees, snow that didn't fall so much as it buried, and a silence so deep it seemed to press against your ribs. The town, nestled at the foot of the Bridger Mountains, was wrapped in a heavy white quilt by mid-December. People huddled indoors, fires crackled behind frosted windows, and even the crows had gone quiet. It was a night that belonged not to the living, but to something older, colder, and more enduring. On such a night, life clung desperately to its warmth. Or, in Sunny's case, to her puppies. Sunny was a 4-year-old golden retriever with a pale golden coat that had once gleamed like honey in the sunlight. Now it was matted with snow, her belly raw from pressing into frozen earth. Her eyes, once the soft brown of melted caramel, held the dull sheen of fatigue and hunger. She had not eaten in 3 days. The only reason she stood now was the 3 tiny bodies wriggling under her chest, and the 4th, silent, barely breathing, tucked beneath her chin. She had clawed through the snow near a broken fence post at the edge of a long-abandoned cornfield, digging a small trench with her paws, curling herself around her litter like a living shield. No one knew where Sunny had come from. Her collar was gone, if she ever had one, and there were no tracks leading in. Only the ones she'd made circling her pups to keep them warm. The snow had erased her story, leaving only this chapter. Occasionally, she lifted her head toward the wind, as if listening for something, footsteps, a voice, maybe a miracle, but heard only the storm's endless breathing. Then she'd lower her head again, and her breath would melt tiny clouds into the fur of her puppies. Across town, a woman named Maggie Quinn stirred from a restless sleep. Maggie, 38, had the delicate frame of someone who had once been strong but had grown hollow with grief. She wore her brunette hair in a loose, uneven bob, the result of cutting it herself in a fit of frustration last spring. Her eyes, green and wide, always looked a little distant, as if she was searching the world for something that had vanished. She taught 3rd grade at Bozeman Elementary, and though her students adored her soft voice and how she drew animals in their notebooks during breaks, they could sense something faded about her, like she was almost fully here, but not quite. Maggie's husband, Evan, had died the previous winter in a road accident during a snowstorm not unlike tonight's. He'd gone out for groceries, texting her a picture of hot cocoa with the caption, "For our movie night," and never came home. Since then, winter had become a season of ghosts for her. She didn't hang wreaths, didn't light candles. She stayed because she didn't know where else to go, and the house they'd shared felt like a mausoleum of warmth she could no longer access. Tonight, she had a dream again. The same one. Snow falling in slow motion. A golden shape in the distance. Barking, desperate but not panicked. Like a question being asked. When she woke, it was 2:37 a.m., and the wind howled like a siren through the cracks in her window. She sat up in bed, heart racing, and whispered, "He's not coming back." But the echo that followed wasn't her husband's name. It was a dog's bark, faint, as if blown in from the edge of town. She stood, pulled on a robe, and padded barefoot to the window. The snow was falling sideways, lit orange by the street lamp. The neighbor's porch light flickered. Something felt off. Maggie pressed her forehead to the glass. Nothing moved, yet she had the sharp sense of something happening just outside the frame of her life. Back on the edge of town, Sunny repositioned herself with a grunt. One of the pups, a darker one with a white patch on its nose, let out a tiny squeal. She nuzzled it closer. Her ribs ached. Her paws had long since gone numb, and a shallow cut on her right hind leg throbbed with cold. Still, she did not sleep. She could not. The snow had begun to fill in the shallow trench she'd made. If the storm continued, they wouldn't survive the night. But still she hoped. She didn't know what for. Dogs don't think in stories. But somewhere in her animal heart, she believed in the shape of kindness. She believed that someone, somewhere, was listening. So she lifted her face once more to the wind, eyes squinting through the flurries. Her nose twitched. There a smell. Wood smoke. Bacon grease. Humans. With a trembling, reluctant whine, Sunny let her head fall again. The puppies had stopped moving. She didn't know if they were asleep or slipping away. She nosed each one gently, checking their breath. 3 still warm. 1, she nudged him harder. He stirred. Relief flickered through her aching frame. She licked his ear, letting her breath warm him. Her eyes flicked up again, and she waited. Somewhere across the fields, Maggie closed the window and went to make tea she wouldn't drink. She didn't know that just 2 miles from her kitchen light, a dog was whispering into the snow. And the snow, impossibly, was listening. It was just past 5 a.m. when Earl Watterson stepped out of his back door, a cracked plastic garbage bag slung over one shoulder and a dented metal flashlight in his hand. The wind hadn't let up all night, and snow clung to his boots with each step across the yard. Earl was 74, hunched but sturdy, with a thick gray mustache that twitched whenever he muttered to himself, which he often did. A retired postmaster, he lived alone in a modest, 2-story home on the edge of town near the tree line. Years ago, his wife Annabeth had insisted on moving closer to the woods, for the peace, she'd said. She passed in her sleep 5 winters ago. Earl still walked out to the same tree every Sunday and left a thermos of her favorite chamomile tea beside the trunk. Tonight, the woods didn't feel peaceful. The wind howled between the pine trees, and the darkness seemed thicker than usual, deeper. As Earl reached the trash bin, his flashlight flickered, once, twice, then steadied. He adjusted his scarf and was about to turn back when he heard it. A sound so soft it might have been swallowed by the snow if not for the stillness that had settled for just a breath. A whimper. No, not quite. More like a cry. High-pitched, desperate, distinctly not human. Earl froze. He tilted his head, straining to hear again. There it was, closer to the tree line, where his yard blurred into the forest's edge. He stepped forward, cautiously, light bouncing off thick drifts of snow. "Hello," he called out, voice unsure. The cry came again, barely audible. Earl narrowed his eyes and muttered, "That ain't no coyote." He turned around quickly, trudged back into the house, and picked up the phone. His fingers, stiff with cold and age, dialed the sheriff's number directly. It rang twice before a groggy voice answered. "Tom here. Sheriff, it's Earl. I just heard something out by my woods. Sounded like a dog. Maybe pups. Crying, maybe hurt." There was silence on the other end for a moment before Tom responded, voice low but alert. "It's bad out, Earl. We're down to 1 plow truck and 2 roads already closed." "You see anything?" "No," Earl said. "Just heard it. But I know what I heard. I believe you. I'll log it in. If it lets up, I'll come check myself. Hope it ain't something freezing to death out there." Earl muttered before hanging up. Across town, the storm still roared, rattling window panes and frosting over cars parked along Magnolia Avenue. At 7 a.m., Maggie Quinn unlocked the classroom door at Bozeman Elementary, her arms full of graded spelling tests and a thermal mug of black tea. Snowflakes clung to her coat as she stepped inside, brushing them off with a tired sigh. She turned on the heater and lights, exhaling a visible cloud of breath as the room warmed slowly. The walls were lined with drawings from her students, turkeys in crayon, a construction paper Christmas tree someone had taped too close to the heater. She set her things down, preparing for another ordinary day of pretending everything was fine. But it wasn't going to be an ordinary day. At 8:12 a.m., Dylan Myers shuffled into the classroom, his coat 2 sizes too big, dark brown curls sticking out from beneath a knitted beanie. Dylan was 9, with a small frame and a quiet demeanor. He often sat alone at recess, preferring to draw animals in his notebook than join in dodgeball. He wasn't the kind of child that teachers worried about. He was polite, punctual, and soft-spoken, but Maggie had noticed how often he flinched when startled or kept glancing over his shoulder. Today, he handed her a folded piece of paper without a word. Maggie took it, eyebrows raised. "You made something?" she asked gently. He nodded. "I had a dream, and when I woke up, I wanted to draw it before I forgot." She opened the paper and froze. It was a picture of a dog, clearly a mother, with 4 puppies huddled under her. They were curled up in what looked like a snowy hole beneath some trees. The mother dog's eyes were wide, sad, pleading. "I thought it looked like you," Dylan said quietly. Not that you look like a dog, he added quickly. Just the way she looks. Like she's waiting for something. Or someone. Maggie couldn't speak for a moment. Her fingers tightened around the drawing. Last night's dream. Snow. A golden shape. Barking. And now this. She cleared her throat. Thank you, Dylan. This is beautiful. Dylan gave her a shy smile and went to his seat. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Maggie kept glancing at the drawing, now pinned to the corner of the whiteboard. During math, her mind wandered. During lunch, she stood by the window and stared at the swirling white outside, imagining a dog just beyond the trees, holding on to life. When the final bell rang, she didn't linger. She grabbed her coat and left. Meanwhile, Sheriff Tom Daniels leaned back in his office chair, staring at the growing list of calls. A woman in Pine Creek reported a power line down. Someone in Gallatin Gateway was stuck in a snowbank. And then, at the bottom of the list, a scribbled note. Possible dog distress. Earl Watterson, Forest Edge. Tom Daniels, 51, had the build of a man who once played football and still carried the memory of it in his shoulders. Salt and pepper hair, square jaw, and a demeanor that could either calm or silence a room, depending on how he looked at you. He'd served in Afghanistan in his 20s before returning home to Bozeman, where he'd grown up working on his uncle's cattle farm. The military had made him cautious, but also deeply instinctual. He tapped a pencil against the desk, looking out the window at the blizzard still whipping across the street. Something about Earl's voice had stayed with him. He picked up the phone and called Animal Services. No answer. He tried the volunteer rescue kennel. Also no answer. He glanced back at the call log and muttered, "Guess I'll go take a look myself." He stood, pulled on his coat, and grabbed his keys. Out beyond the town limits, the snow continued to fall in heavy waves, and somewhere beneath a hollow near the tree line, Sunny blinked slowly, her body trembling from exhaustion. 3 of her pups still moved. 1 was frighteningly still. She knew her time was running thin, but something in her lifted her head once more. And in the distance, faintly, too faintly to trust, but still there, was the sound of tires crunching over snow. Chapter 3. A flicker of hope. The snow was relentless. Sheriff Tom Daniels had driven through his fair share of Montana storms in his decades of service, but tonight's blizzard seemed to carry an edge, something beyond weather. He steered his battered Ford Explorer slowly down the tree-lined road that curved toward the edge of Bozeman's wilderness. The headlights cut through the white haze in dull swaths. His gloved hands gripped the steering wheel tight, and his eyes flicked to the snowbanks rising on either side of the road like silent sentinels. Somewhere out there, a cry had been heard, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about a dog. It felt older, deeper, like a promise trying not to break. Sitting beside him in the passenger seat was Deputy Lena Harwood, a lean woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and sharper instincts. She wore a thick green parka, her strawberry blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail under her knit cap. Lena had grown up in Helena, the daughter of a nurse and a forest ranger. She'd been with the sheriff's department for nearly a decade and was known for her quiet demeanor and unshakable composure, especially in crisis. She was the type who thought before speaking and acted when others still hesitated. In the back seat, rookie Deputy Brent Holloway sat with his nose nearly pressed to the window. Brent was 24, broad-shouldered with a nervous energy that vibrated through his knees. This was his first winter on the job, and while eager to prove himself, he hadn't yet learned the rhythm of silence that came with mountain patrol. He shifted now, adjusting the scarf around his neck. "You sure about this?" Brent asked. "Nothing out here but trees and trouble." Tom didn't answer right away. He slowed the vehicle as they neared a narrow service path used mostly by power line technicians in the summer. "I'm sure I heard something," he finally said. "And I'm sure Earl did too." Lena gave him a sidelong glance. "Your gut's talking again?" Tom exhaled a short breath, almost a laugh. "Yeah. And for once, I'm listening." They parked at the edge of the tree line, where the road ended in a wall of untouched snow. Stepping out, Tom was hit with a blast of icy wind that nearly took his breath. He flipped his collar up and motioned for the others to follow. The snow reached halfway up their calves as they moved in a line, flashlights cutting through the dark, boots crunching over layers of frozen crust. For Tom, every step forward was accompanied by a memory. Years ago, in a small village outside Kabul, a military building had collapsed after an explosion. He'd been trapped under beams, lungs filled with dust. A Belgian Malinois named Scout had clawed through wreckage to find him, dragging help to his side. Scout had saved his life and died a year later from cancer caused by chemical exposure during the war. Tom hadn't spoken much about Scout in years. But tonight, something about that cry in the storm had pulled that old thread loose. They moved deeper into the forest. The trees pressed close, branches heavy with snow. Then Lena held up a hand, stopping them. She pointed. Footprints. Not human. Small, light, and clustered. Brent whispered, "Pause." Tom knelt down, brushing snow away. Small ones. More than one set. They followed the trail slowly, carefully, hearts beating faster with each step. The wind howled again, threatening to erase their path, but it didn't matter. Tom could feel it now, humming beneath his skin. Something alive was waiting. Then they saw it. Half buried in a drift, against the base of a crooked pine, was a shallow hollow. Inside, a pale shape. Tom raised his hand to stop the others, crouched low, and approached with care. It was a dog. A golden retriever, though the snow had dimmed her color. Her body was curled tightly around 4 tiny puppies, who barely stirred under the frost-covered fur. Her eyes locked onto Tom's as he drew near, not wild, not frightened, but tired, resigned, and yet still holding on. "Hey there, girl," Tom whispered, kneeling a few feet away. "We're here now." The dog made no move to run. No growl. No bark. Only a slow blink, as if her energy was too precious to waste. Her nose twitched. She laid her head down gently on one of the pups. Tom's throat tightened. "She's protecting them," Lena said behind him, voice hushed. Tom removed his gloves and slowly reached forward. "It's okay. You did good. You did real good." His fingers touched her fur. It was damp, icy, and trembling. Carefully, he reached beneath her, feeling for the pups. One was frighteningly still. Another squirmed weakly. "She's got 4," he said. "One of them might not make it." Brent knelt beside him, already unzipping his jacket. "Use this. My lining's wool." They worked silently, wrapping the puppies first, then preparing to move the mother. She let them lift her, barely, but stayed limp, head lolling slightly in Tom's arms. "She's half frozen," Lena said. "We need to move fast." Tom carried Sunny. He didn't know her name yet, but it would come, back through the snow, the wind whipping harder now as if the storm had decided to test their resolve. They didn't speak, didn't breathe deeply until the vehicle's doors slammed shut and heat began to pump. In the back seat, Tom laid the mother dog gently on a folded blanket. The pups were bundled between them, pressed close. As they drove back toward town, Lena finally broke the silence. "She didn't flinch once," she said softly. "Just looked at you like she was waiting." Tom didn't look away from the road. "Yeah," he said, "like she knew we'd come. Somehow." And deep inside, though he'd never admitted aloud, Tom felt something settle, as if Scout's spirit had reached out through the storm to guide them. It was a foolish thought, but it felt true. The small animal clinic on the south edge of Bozeman was one of those quiet places that rarely made noise, unless it was the clatter of paws or the occasional bark of a nervous rescue. A faded wooden sign above the door read, "Gallatin Creek Veterinary Center," and its windows were fogged from the heat inside, trying to fight off the ruthless cold still pounding outside. The storm had slowed to a whisper by dawn, but the sky remained a cold gray bowl over the city, as if mourning something it couldn't name. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the reception area and the hallway beyond, where a handful of metal kennels lined the walls. In one of those kennels, nestled in a bundle of wool blankets, lay Sunny. Her golden coat was no longer bright. It clung to her ribs in damp clumps, and her breathing was shallow but steady. 3 puppies were pressed against her belly, tiny bodies rising and falling with her. The 4th, smaller, thinner, lay wrapped in a separate towel under a heat lamp. But the lamp had been turned off an hour ago. Dr. Elise Monroe, a compact woman in her early 40s with quick hands and tired eyes, had made the call shortly after the sun rose. The pup hadn't made it. Dr. Monroe had the calm efficiency of someone who'd seen too many emergencies and learned how to carry grief like another tool in her coat pocket. Her chestnut hair was pinned up loosely under a surgical cap, and a small crescent moon tattoo peeked out from behind her left ear when she turned her head. She rarely spoke in long sentences, but when she did, her voice was gentle, more for the animals than for the people. She stood now beside Sunny's kennel, chart in hand, murmuring to herself. Mother's temperature stabilizing. Pups nursing slowly. Fourth pup expired due to systemic hypothermia. No chip or collar found. From behind her, the nurse, Carl, stepped in. He was a large man with kind eyes, probably in his late 50s, with gray stubble and the sort of voice that made animals stop shaking. He looked at the wrapped towel under the lamp, then at Sunny. She hasn't touched her food, he said. She won't, Elise replied, closing the file. Not yet. She's grieving. Carl sighed. They always know. Yeah, Elise whispered. They do. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie Quinn stood in her kitchen with a tin of oatmeal cookies in her hands and indecision clouding her face. Her boots were already on, laces half-tied, coat draped over a dining chair. The drawing Dylan had given her still lay on the counter, the edges curling slightly from last night's condensation. She stared at it again, the soft lines, the snow, the eyes of the mother dog. The dream hadn't returned, but the weight in her chest had. Something had shifted since yesterday, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. She hadn't visited the vet clinic in months. The last time had been with her late husband's golden retriever, Jasper, an old soul who had passed away just 4 weeks after Evan. Jasper had been her link to something living, something real. After that, she had promised herself no more animals. No more losses. She couldn't take the silence that followed. But the drawing, the dream, the ache. She picked up her coat, tucked the cookie tin under one arm, and headed out. By the time she reached Gallatin Creek Veterinary, snow was falling again, just lightly, like a memory being retold in fragments. Maggie pushed open the door, and the little bell above it chimed. Carl looked up from behind the counter. Miss Quinn. She nodded, brushing snow from her hair. I brought cookies. And I heard about the dog. The mother. From last night. Can I see her? Carl nodded, voice soft. She's in the back. Elise is with her. As Maggie followed Carl down the hallway, the scent of antiseptic grew stronger, but it was the quiet that struck her. Not silence. There were sounds. The hum of machines, the shuffling of paws, the low moans of waking dogs, but a kind of stillness, like the place was holding its breath. Then they stopped outside a kennel, and Carl stepped aside. Sunny lay motionless, her body curled protectively around the 3 remaining puppies. Her eyes were half-lidded, unfocused. Elise looked up from her clipboard. You're the teacher, right? Maggie Quinn. Yes. She's not aggressive, Elise said. Just exhausted. Physically, emotionally. She's lost a pup. Maggie stepped forward slowly, crouching down until she was eye level with the kennel. So have I, she whispered. Sunny stirred faintly. Her ears twitched, and she blinked once, as if waking into a dream she wasn't sure she trusted. Maggie sat all the way down on the cold tile floor, pulling her knees to her chest. She watched Sunny for a long moment, and then, without meaning to, began to cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just tears, quiet and sudden, falling from eyes that had stayed dry for too long. Maggie didn't wipe them away. Sunny lifted her head, just slightly, and with great effort, she shifted forward until her nose touched the metal bars. Her muzzle pressed through, just barely, and she touched Maggie's hand, so lightly it could have been imagined. Maggie didn't move. Hey, she said softly. It's okay. You don't have to be strong right now. Carl watched from the hallway, one hand resting against the doorframe. Elise scribbled something in her chart, then smiled without looking up. First food she might take is love. The snow was beginning to melt. Not dramatically, not yet, but in the way that meant winter was loosening its grip. Thin streams trickled down from roof eaves, puddles formed under streetlights, and the frost on Maggie Quinn's windows took longer to return each morning. Bozeman remained wrapped in its usual chill, but the bitter edge had dulled. Inside Maggie's small yellow house on Juniper Lane, the air smelled faintly of cinnamon, damp wool, and something else, new beginnings. The living room had been rearranged to accommodate a makeshift pin of soft blankets and pillows in the corner. A portable heater hummed gently, set to low, and next to it lay Sunny, her golden fur cleaner now, brushed and gleaming under the morning light. Her body still bore the signs of hardship, thinner than it should be, eyes weary, but she no longer trembled. One by one, the 3 surviving puppies, now more active, nursed or tumbled in sleepy play beside her. Maggie knelt nearby, gently refilling a water bowl and whispering softly to them, as if her voice alone could knit their hearts back together. After her first visit to the clinic, something in Maggie had shifted. She didn't go home and return to silence. She stayed. Sat beside Sunny until the clinic closed. Returned the next day with supplies, treats, and eventually, a request. Dr. Elise Monroe had hesitated. "It's not typical," she'd said, arms crossed, tired eyes scanning the recovery chart. "They still need round-the-clock monitoring." "But the clinic's full," Maggie pointed out gently. "And I'm not. I'm home. I'm ready." Elise studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "On one condition, you bring them back twice a week for checkups, no matter what. I promise." So now Sunny and her pups lived in Maggie's home, nestled into a space that had been quiet for too long. Maggie had converted her guest room into a nursery, with meticulous care, even hanging an old mobile from the ceiling, a leftover relic from a past life, a gift for a child she never had. Sunny had taken to the home with caution at first, often retreating to corners, watching Maggie from beneath lowered lids. But over the days, her trust grew. She ate. She licked Maggie's hand. She even wagged her tail, just once, like a fragile memory returning. That Saturday morning, Dylan Myers appeared at Maggie's doorstep carrying a plastic container of peanut butter crackers and a bundle of comic books under one arm. His brown curls poked out from under a dinosaur-themed beanie, and his cheeks were flushed from the cold. Maggie opened the door before he could knock. "You said I could come help," he said simply. Maggie smiled. "You're right on time." Dylan had become a frequent visitor since Maggie mentioned the puppies during class. At first, he lingered in the doorway, shy, barely speaking above a whisper. But now he slipped out of his boots with practiced ease, padding into the living room and immediately dropping to his knees beside the dog bed. Sunny lifted her head and, after a moment, allowed him to pet her flank. "She remembers me," Dylan said with quiet pride. "She does," Maggie replied, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, watching them. "She likes your voice." The boy's connection to Sunny had deepened quickly. Maggie wasn't surprised. Dylan had always been an observant child, more sensitive than most his age, often drifting alone at recess, speaking only when sure he'd be heard. A few months back, his parents had reported bullying at school. Nothing violent, just words, the kind that stick like burrs in the ribs. Since then, Maggie had made quiet efforts to pair him with gentler classmates. But it wasn't until Sunny arrived that Maggie saw something change in him. That day, Dylan read aloud from one of his comics, showing the puppies each page. They didn't understand the story, of course, but they understood his tone, soft, excited, filled with affection. One of the pups, a tiny female with a dark nose and mismatched ears, pawed at the pages as if offering commentary. "You should name her," Maggie said suddenly, surprising herself. Dylan blinked. "Me? You read to her. You feed her. I think she'd like a name from you." He looked down, thoughtful. "Maybe. Millie. My grandma's name was Millie. She made banana pancakes and told jokes about cows." "Then Millie it is." The puppy sneezed. As the afternoon settled in, Maggie moved around the kitchen, preparing soup while Dylan sat with Sunny. The house was no longer quiet. There was the sound of laughter, small and uncertain, but real. There were the soft patterings of paws, the clinking of dishes, the rhythmic lull of Dylan's storytelling. And above all, there was warmth, not just from the heater, but from something older, something truer. The kind of warmth that doesn't come from fire or fabric, but from presence. Later, after Dylan had gone home with a promise to return Sunday afternoon, Maggie sat beside Sunny with a cup of tea. The dog shifted closer, resting her chin on Maggie's thigh. Maggie reached out, fingers curling into soft fur. Her heart still ached, would always ache, she suspected, but the weight was no longer unbearable. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to Sunny, the universe, or her husband's memory. Maybe all three. Sunny blinked slowly and let out a contented sigh. Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily, dancing through rays of weak sunlight. Winter had not ended, but inside this small house on Juniper Lane, spring had taken its first breath. The week that followed brought a subtle rhythm to Maggie's home. Early feedings, puppy naps, vet check-ins, and afternoons filled with Dylan's soft voice reading comic books aloud. But as the snow began to thin and patches of dead grass peeked through along the edges of the sidewalk, something darker began to surface, something that didn't melt with the frost. It started with a routine checkup at the Gallatin Creek Veterinary Center. Dr. Elise Monroe had been monitoring Sunny's recovery closely and, that morning, had decided to give her a more thorough exam now that she was strong enough to handle it. Maggie watched from a chair in the corner of the room, sipping lukewarm tea from a travel mug, while Sunny stood calmly on the exam table, her tail tucked but not trembling like before. Elise gently parted the thick fur around Sunny's neck and froze. Her gloved fingers brushed a slightly raised patch of skin just below the collarbone. Maggie sat forward. "What is it?" Elise didn't answer right away. She moved her hands along Sunny's shoulders, then down her back. There, just above the spine near the left hip, she found another. Scars. 2 of them. Both clean, healed over, but unmistakable. She was chained, Elise said finally, voice low. For a long time. These aren't from running through bushes or fences. These are tension scars. Pressure points where something heavy rubbed her raw, again and again. Maggie's grip tightened around the mug. Like a collar? Elise nodded. Or a metal tether. Possibly both. Judging by the placement, it wasn't for safety. It was to restrain her. Probably in a fixed position. Sunny looked up at them both, ears down but eyes clear. She didn't flinch. Didn't whine. She simply waited. Has anyone reported a missing golden retriever recently? Maggie asked. No. Elise said, pulling off her gloves. But this doesn't look like someone who lost a pet. It looks like someone who discarded one. Later that day, Sheriff Tom Daniels sat behind his desk at the Bozeman precinct, a file open in front of him with photos clipped to the inside. Lena Harwood stood across from him, arms folded, reading over his shoulder. The images were grainy, taken from a body cam, but clear enough. The snow-covered hollow where Sunny had been found, the torn blankets, the pressed-down trench in the snow, and the old, rusted fence post nearby. A single boot print had been captured in the soft ice just outside the area. I keep thinking about that fence post, Tom said. Something about the way it was bent. It looked like a tie point. You think she was dumped there? Not exactly, he replied. I think she escaped. But not from far away. Lena frowned. You're thinking local. I'm thinking within 2 miles. Tom stood and walked over to a map tacked on the wall. A red circle was drawn around the area near Earl Watterson's property, with a pin marking the exact spot Sunny was found. He tapped the upper left quadrant, wooded, largely undeveloped. There's an old farmstead up here, he said. Been abandoned for years. Belonged to a family called the Pratts. They moved out sometime around 2008. No utilities, no recent tax filings. Lena raised a brow. You want to check it out? I already did. Tom pulled a photo from his desk drawer and handed it to her. It was taken just that morning. He'd driven out before dawn and walked the perimeter on foot. The image showed the side of a dilapidated barn, one of the doors hanging off a rusted hinge. In the snow nearby, half buried, was a short length of chain, still connected to a steel stake driven into the ground. At the end of the chain was a worn leather collar, frayed and snapped. Lena leaned in. That could have been hers. Tom nodded. That's what I'm thinking. He reached for his phone and called Elise. She's with Maggie now, Elise said. Recovering well. But those scars, they're real, Tom. She was held somewhere. Likely neglected. Possibly abused. Thanks, Tom said. That's what I needed to confirm. That evening, Tom drove back to the farmstead alone. The sun was beginning to set, casting long orange beams through the bare trees. The barn loomed in silhouette, silent and skeletal against the fading light. He moved slowly, boots crunching over brittle ice, flashlights sweeping across old tire tracks frozen in the mud. Inside the barn, the smell was musty, but not fresh. No recent use. Just remnants, discarded feed bags, a rusted water bowl, scratched walls. There were claw marks near the stall doors. Some were shallow, others deeper. He stood in the middle of the space for a long time, listening. Nothing. But he could feel it. Something had happened here. Not just abandonment. Something uglier. Colder. Back at Maggie's, Sunny lay curled on her blanket, her pups nestled into her side. Maggie sat nearby, brushing a few tangles from Sunny's tail. She didn't know what Tom had found yet. Didn't know about the barn or the chain, or the collar buried in snow. But as she brushed, she paused over the scar on Sunny's back. Gently, she ran a finger along it. Sunny didn't move, didn't flinch, just turned her head slightly and met Maggie's eyes. Maggie smiled, a sad kind of smile. Whoever you belonged to before, they don't deserve you now. Sunny blinked. Her tail thumped once against the blanket. By midweek, the snow had thinned to slush in most parts of town, turning sidewalks into patchworks of gray ice and shallow puddles. But at the outskirts, where the woods gave way to forgotten farm roads, there were still places untouched, where wind-sculpted drifts clung like secrets waiting to be unearthed. In one such place, nestled between two pine trees on Route 6, Sheriff Tom Daniels stood beside a weathered roadside camera pole, arms crossed, eyes narrowing against the wind. He wasn't alone. A technician from the Department of Transportation named Mike Jensen crouched nearby, prying open the camera's casing with gloved hands. Mike was in his early 40s, stocky and balding, with a practical demeanor and an aversion to unnecessary talking. He grunted once as the screen flickered to life. The footage pulled from the device, now loading onto a small laptop balanced on the hood of Tom's cruiser. Got footage from that night, Mike muttered. Lucky, storm didn't kill the feed. You're looking at 1:23 a.m., 2 nights before the call came in. The screen showed a wide-angle view of the tree line along Route 6, snow swirling in every direction, headlights appearing from the right. A pickup truck rolled into frame. Old, heavy, dark green, or maybe black. It slowed near the ditch and came to a stop for exactly 28 seconds. Then it pulled away, leaving something behind that moved. Barely visible, just a blur against the snow. Mike squinted. You thinking that's the dog? Tom nodded. And I'm thinking whoever dropped her there didn't want her found. Mike leaned back. License plates buried in glare. Doesn't matter. I know that truck. He'd seen it before, months ago, parked outside the rundown trailer on Pine Hollow Road. Belonged to a man named Dean Lasker. Thin, weathered, with a hunched posture and a twitch in his left eye that never seemed to rest. Dean had been cited twice in the past 4 years for animal neglect. Unkempt kennels, unlicensed breeding, malnutrition cases. But he always skirted real consequence. Claimed misunderstanding. Claimed the dogs weren't his. Claimed they were strays, or gifted to him, or that neighbors dumped them in his yard. Tom had never been convinced. He stood now, wind pressing against his coat, watching that truck disappear into the dark again, and felt a familiar burn in his gut. Not anger exactly, but something close. A refusal to let cruelty be the last word. Back in town, Maggie sat at her kitchen table, elbows resting on a faded placemat, a cup of tea long gone cold in her hands. Sunny lay curled beside the heating vent, her 3 pups now mobile enough to wobble clumsily across the living room floor. One of them, Millie, the puppy Dylan had named, chased a sock with ridiculous determination, her tail spinning like a propeller. But Maggie didn't smile. She stared at the scars beneath Sunny's fur, at the gentleness in her eyes despite everything, and felt a storm of questions rising. How could someone look at this creature, kind, loyal, maternal, and decide she wasn't worth keeping alive? What dark place did a person have to sink into to abandon life in a snowbank? She stood up suddenly, pacing the room. I don't understand it, she muttered, not realizing she'd spoken aloud. Sunny lifted her head slightly. Maggie stopped pacing and looked down. I don't want to just feel sorry anymore, she whispered. I want to do something. Later that afternoon, Dylan arrived for his usual visit, his cheeks pink with wind and a book tucked under his arm. Maggie noticed the title before he could hand it over. Dogs Never Leave You. A children's story printed decades ago, its corners worn, cover faded. She raised an eyebrow. I found it in my grandma's attic, Dylan explained. It's about a dog who follows this boy through every season, even when people forget about him. Even when the boy grows up, the dog waits. He never leaves. Not once. Maggie sat down, eyes welling despite herself. I thought you should have it, Dylan added. Because Sunny waited too. For a long moment, she couldn't speak. She took the book with both hands, tracing the old title with her thumb. Thank you, she finally said. You have no idea how much that means to me. That night, after Dylan had gone, Maggie lit a candle and sat in the quiet living room, Sunny at her side. The pups slept in a pile near her feet. The book sat on her lap, and a decision, long coiled in her chest, began to take shape. The next morning, Sheriff Tom rang her doorbell. When she opened the door, the look on his face told her everything. "You found out who did it," she said. Tom nodded, stepping inside as she waved him toward the kitchen. "Dean Lasker," he said simply. "Same guy we've circled before. This time, we have footage, clear enough to prove intent." "Will there be charges?" "There can be, and there will be, but it's going to take time." "He's slippery." Maggie poured him a cup of coffee and placed it on the counter. "I want to help." Tom raised an eyebrow. "You? I'm not a cop, but I'm a teacher, and people listen when teachers speak. Especially here. I want to tell Sonny's story. At school. At town hall. Anywhere someone will hear it." Tom looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I'll make sure people listen." The courthouse in Bozeman was not a grand building. It sat modestly along a street lined with bare-limbed trees and fading holiday decorations, its white columns softened by the gray weight of winter. Snow had fallen steadily since dawn, dusting the sidewalks and the stone steps with a thin, patient blanket. Inside, the walls echoed with the low murmur of legal proceedings and the occasional shuffle of boots against tile. Courtroom 2B was warm but tense. The benches were mostly full, neighbors, reporters, a few high school students from a civics class, and several volunteers from the Gallatin County Animal Rescue League. Among them sat a petite woman in a maroon knit dress, her dark hair pulled into a loose braid, hands folded neatly in her lap. Maggie Quinn, now something of a quiet symbol in the community, glanced once more at the folded note cards in her coat pocket, though she wasn't sure she would need them. At her feet, Sonny lay still, her coat brushed to a golden sheen, her head gently resting on Maggie's boot. The three puppies were being looked after at home by Carl, the veterinary nurse, who'd volunteered for puppy duty with the kind of fierce pride only a grandparent-level dog lover could muster. Across the aisle, the defendant sat slouched in a wrinkled flannel shirt and torn jeans. Dean Lasker had thinning brown hair, a crooked nose that had never healed right, and a mouth that seemed permanently twisted in either contempt or disbelief. He didn't look at Sonny. He didn't look at Maggie. His gaze stayed on the table in front of him, where a court-appointed attorney sat flipping through documents he didn't seem to care much about. Sheriff Tom Daniels stood near the front, back straight, his badge glinting slightly under the fluorescent lights. His presence was calm but firm, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. When the judge entered, an older man named Harold Yates, with silver eyebrows and a no-nonsense air, the room rose. Then the proceedings began. The prosecution presented its case swiftly but clearly. Surveillance footage showing Dean's truck stopping in the woods. Photographs of the abandoned barn, the rusted chain, the leather collar. Testimony from Elise Monroe detailing the extent of Sonny's physical trauma and the psychological scars consistent with prolonged neglect. Tom spoke next, describing the search, the discovery, the evidence, and the timeline that led them to Dean. Then, it was Maggie's turn. She hadn't intended to speak. But when the judge opened the floor for character statements and asked if anyone had more to add on behalf of the animal in question, Maggie rose. She didn't unfold her note cards. "My name is Maggie Quinn," she began, voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I'm a schoolteacher here in Bozeman. I didn't know Sonny." She gestured gently to the golden shape beside her. "Until the night she was rescued. I wasn't part of the search. I didn't even know she existed. But since she came into my life, I've remembered how to breathe again." The room was very quiet. "I lost my husband last year," she continued, her voice growing softer but no less sure. "And I lost a part of myself. I shut my door to everyone. Friends. Family. Joy. Then this dog came into my house. Broken, starving, grieving her own loss, and she healed me. She lay at my feet, and somehow, I remembered how to stand." She looked at the judge, then at the jury. "She's not a piece of evidence. She's not just a victim. She's hope, and she deserves to be protected." There were tears in the room. One of the rescue volunteers sniffed audibly. Even Judge Yates blinked longer than necessary. Then he looked down at Dean Lasker, who still hadn't met anyone's eyes. "Mr. Lasker, do you have anything to say?" Dean shifted in his seat, shrugged, and muttered something unintelligible. His attorney elbowed him, and he cleared his throat. "Wasn't like I meant harm," he mumbled. "She wasn't earning. Couldn't sell the pups. Wasn't worth the food. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Someone muttered, "Monster." Maggie stiffened, but said nothing. Judge Yates nodded solemnly and reached for his gavel. This court finds sufficient evidence to determine neglect and abandonment. Mr. Dean Lasker is hereby fined, barred from owning, breeding, or housing any domestic animals for the remainder of his natural life, and referred for psychiatric evaluation as part of his probationary oversight. This court is adjourned. The gavel hit the wood with finality. Outside the courthouse, snow was still falling gently, but the sky had lightened. Maggie stepped into the cold with Sonny at her side, the dog's leash held loosely but with trust. A small crowd had gathered, neighbors, reporters, strangers holding handmade signs that read, "Every life matters," and "Justice for Sonny." Someone reached forward and handed Maggie a single daffodil. She smiled and took it. As she walked down the courthouse steps, Sonny remained pressed close, her head still low but her stride more confident. At the bottom of the steps, Dylan stood waiting, holding a thermos of hot cocoa and wearing the proudest smile Maggie had ever seen. "She did it," he whispered. Maggie nodded. "We all did." The snow had all but melted now, giving way to the soft muddiness of early spring in Bozeman. The trees remained bare, but tiny buds had started to push their way out along the edges of Maggie Quinn's backyard. The sun, still shy most mornings, peeked through the clouds just enough to warm the air past freezing. It was the season of beginnings, not with fanfare or fireworks, but quiet gestures. The first robin, a patch of grass, a warm breath on a cold hand. And, in Maggie's case, the first day is something she hadn't been in a long time, a mother again. Not to a child, but to a family nonetheless. She stood barefoot in the soft soil of her backyard, hands on her hips, watching as Carl, his sleeves rolled to the elbows and a tool belt slung low on his hips, hammered the final plank into the low white fence that enclosed the new section of yard. Carl had the patient energy of someone who'd done more for animals than most had done for people, and this project had become his latest mission. Maggie had simply asked for advice on fencing. He showed up the next day with lumber and blueprints. Sonny lay stretched on the porch behind her, belly exposed to the sun, eyes half-lidded. The three puppies, now nearing 10 weeks old, tumbled across the grass in bursts of wobbly energy. Millie, the smallest and boldest, was in the middle of a full-scale battle with a pine cone. The other two, Bear, a chunky male with massive paws, and Lulu, a soft-eyed pup with one ear permanently flopped sideways, chased each other in wide, clumsy circles. Maggie turned to the far corner of the yard, where a small wooden sign had been installed. The lettering wasn't perfect, some of the paint had smudged, but it was beautiful in its intention. Sonny's Garden, it read, in childlike block letters surrounded by little yellow paw prints. Dylan had painted it himself. He stood proudly beside it now, backpack slung over one shoulder, cheeks still pink from running over after school. "Do you think she knows?" he asked. Maggie looked at Sonny, who had just lifted her head and was watching Dylan with serene affection. "I think she does," Maggie said. "And I think she's proud of you." Dylan kicked at the grass, embarrassed. "The class wanted to do something, so we made adoption cards for all the puppies. Even though they're not going anywhere." Maggie laughed. "You're right, they're not. But I love the idea. Want to show them to me?" He pulled a small stack of index cards from his backpack. Each one featured a drawing, crayon depictions of Millie, Bear, and Lulu, with carefully written bios underneath. "Lulu loves ear rubs," one read. Another said, "Bear is afraid of squirrels but pretends he's not." Millie's card had a bold header, "Will protect you from pine cones." Maggie ran her fingers over the cards, blinking away the unexpected sting behind her eyes. "You're amazing, you know that?" she said. Dylan shrugged. "I just wanted to make it real. For them. Like it's really forever." It was. The formal adoption paperwork had been filed that morning. Dr. Elise Monroe had signed off with a smirk and a heartfelt congratulations. Sheriff Tom Daniels had dropped by the vet clinic on his way to the station and handed Maggie a small box wrapped in butcher paper. Inside was a leather collar, hand-tooled and dyed honey brown, with a tag that read, "Sonny Home." Maggie had clipped it on with trembling fingers. Now, as the sun dipped lower and painted the house in golden light, she watched her new family tumble and play and rest in the garden built just for them. She thought about how this house, once quiet and heavy with grief, now breathed in rhythm again. Laughter in the kitchen, paw prints on the floor, barking at squirrels, and crying when the food bowl emptied too fast. Life, in all its chaotic beauty. The following Friday, Maggie arrived at Bozeman Elementary with a folded table, a cake in a cardboard box, and a plastic banner that read Happy Gotcha Day. Dylan met her at the door with a clipboard and a checklist. I have everything, he said. Cookies, apple juice, music playlist, and the surprise. Maggie raised an eyebrow. There's a surprise? You'll see. The classroom had been transformed. The desks were pushed to the sides, balloons floated gently along the ceiling, and drawings of Sunny and the puppies lined the walls. Students wore construction paper dog ears and took turns showing off their best puppy impressions. Maggie sat in a small chair in the corner, overcome. Then Dylan stood and tapped a ruler on his desk for attention. This is a party, he said, but also a ceremony. He held up a piece of paper, an adoption certificate, carefully copied from one Elise had shown them at the clinic. We, the class of room 204, officially welcome Sunny and her puppies into the Quinn family forever. There was applause, cheering, and then, unexpectedly, Sunny entered the room. Carl had brought her, wearing a bandana with paw prints. She trotted toward Maggie without hesitation and laid her head in her lap. Everyone clapped again. Later that night, after the party, the cleanup, and the leftover cake wrapped in foil, Maggie sat in her living room surrounded by crayon drawings, used balloons, and a family that had grown under her feet. She looked down at Sunny, curled beside her on the rug. You're not just a dog, she whispered. You're a beginning. Sunny thumped her tail once. And for the first time in what felt like years, Maggie felt whole. Snow had returned to Bozeman. Not the harsh, biting kind that swallowed roads and silenced voices, but the softer kind that painted rooftops gently and whispered against windows like a familiar song. A year had passed since the night Sunny had curled herself around her pups beneath a pine tree, abandoned and half-frozen. Now, as the first flakes of winter drifted lazily outside the window, Maggie Quinn stood in her kitchen, warm light casting gold across the walls, and stirred cinnamon into her coffee. The house was filled with sound. Laughter echoed from the living room, where Dylan and two of his school friends, Ellie and Marcus, were trying to teach Millie how to high-five with a treat. The golden retriever pup, no longer tiny, but still ridiculously expressive, was responding with enthusiasm and zero coordination. Lulu had taken refuge beneath the couch with a slipper trophy, while Bear snored on his back beside the fireplace, his oversized paws twitching in a dream. And Sunny, now a year older, with a few strands of gray around her muzzle, sat by the window, watching the snow fall. Her body had softened with age, her steps slower, but her eyes were just as bright. They followed Maggie with the same quiet reverence, the same unwavering calm. She no longer flinched at loud noises or doorbells. She trusted the warmth around her. Maggie approached and knelt down, resting her hand on Sunny's shoulder. You remember this time last year? She whispered. How cold it was. Sunny turned and gently pressed her nose to Maggie's cheek. No answer, of course, but something in that touch carried memory. Later that afternoon, after the kids had gone and the puppies were passed out in their usual pile on the rug, Maggie sat at her desk. The glow from her reading lamp was soft and amber, casting gentle shadows across the page. A blank Word document blinked on the screen in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she began to type. We found each other in the snow, that was the title. The rest came slowly, like breath drawn after a long silence. She wrote about the first time she saw Sunny, half buried in snow, eyes wide with exhaustion. She wrote about grief and healing, and what it meant to be seen by something that had no words but all the understanding in the world. She wrote about Dylan, and the garden, and the morning she realized she had stopped dreaming about loss and started dreaming about laughter again. She wrote without flourish, without drama, just truth, and she ended it with one line. I thought I rescued her, but maybe it was her who rescued me. The article was submitted to the local paper, the Bozeman Voice, and by the next week, it had spread across Montana. Then beyond, online blogs, animal rescue forums, and even a morning talk show in Seattle picked it up. Emails flooded in. Cards arrived at the school. One woman sent a painting of Sunny curled around her pups, snow falling around them like feathers. But Maggie didn't care about the attention. What mattered was the way people wrote back, telling her about their dogs, about the pets who had healed their marriages, who had comforted them through miscarriages, who had waited at the door after every shift in war zones and hospitals and long graveyard hours. The world was hurting, but it was also loving. On the morning of the first true snowfall of December, Maggie and Dylan stood together in the backyard. Sunny's garden had been decorated for the season, twinkle lights along the fence, a new wooden bench with paw print carvings, and a birdhouse shaped like a dog bone. Sunny wandered among the snow patches with slow steps. Bear trotted after her, ever the shadow. Lulu barked at a cardinal on the fence post. Millie, naturally, tried to eat the snowflakes. Maggie turned to Dylan. He was taller now, his face leaner, his voice deeper by a fraction. But his eyes were the same, gentle, curious, and full of that quiet magic children carry before the world teaches them to be careful. You still think she remembers everything? He asked. Maggie nodded. She remembers what matters. They watched Sunny sniff at the base of a tree. The same tree where Maggie had once leaned to cry, long before she realized her tears had thawed into something warm. And there, beneath that old maple, Sunny turned and looked back at them. Her eyes glowed with something beyond recognition, something that reached across winters and wounds and found them whole again. There are moments in life that seem so dark that there is no way out, like Sunny, abandoned in the snow, and Maggie, lost in the pain of loss. But even in the coldest winter, God is at work. He sends gentle souls, human or animal, to heal, to love, to remind us that love and hope are never frozen forever. Sunny is more than a rescued dog. She is a miracle. She is God's hand, reaching through the snow, touching a woman's broken heart. And Maggie, in reaching out to embrace a life that seemed lost, learns to love again. Sometimes, in saving another soul, we inadvertently save ourselves. A lesson for all of us. Even if you are going through a winter of the soul, trust that God is still at work. Open your heart, even if just a little. Miracles don't always come in bright lights. Sometimes, they come in 4 little feet, sad eyes, and unconditional loyalty. If this story touches your heart, please share it with your family and friends, because you never know who out there needs a reminder that they're not alone. Comment Amen if you believe that God is still doing miracles every day. Leave a comment. Subscribe to the channel to spread more healing stories. May God bless everyone who reads this. And if you ever doubt that love can save, remember Sunny. Comment Amen if you believe that love and loyalty are miracles from God.